What happens when a police officer uses his authority to demean a black driver, only to find himself depending on her in his darkest moment? Officer Jake Turner adjusted his rearview mirror as he cruised through the quiet streets of Brookhaven, a suburban neighborhood he'd patrolled for years. To Jake, order was paramount. He prided himself on being a firm, no-nonsense officer, quick to spot anything or anyone that seemed out of place. Brookhaven was a well-maintained enclave of upper-middle-class families, and Jake believed it was his responsibility to ensure it stayed that way. Driving a few car lengths ahead of him, a modest sedan caught his attention. The vehicle was clean but not flashy, and its driver, a black woman with a focused expression, seemed unfamiliar. Jake frowned, suspicion stirring. He flipped on his lights, his heart quickening as the car pulled to the curb without hesitation. "Let's see what this is about," he muttered to himself, stepping out of the cruiser. Dr. Maya Brooks, meanwhile, glanced in her rearview mirror, her calm composure unshaken despite the interruption. She was a renowned surgeon, known for her precision in the operating room and her ability to remain collected under pressure. Today was no exception. She was on her way to perform a critical surgery, one that required her full focus. Yet as the flashing lights loomed behind her, Maya felt a pang of frustration. Jake approached her window, his expression stern. "License and registration, ma'am," he demanded without preamble. Maya nodded, retrieving her documents. "May I ask why I've been stopped, officer?" "You didn't signal before turning," Jake replied curtly, though he hadn't actually seen her commit any infraction. His tone carried an air of authority that left no room for discussion. As Maya handed over her documents, her mind remained sharp. She recognized his demeanor. It wasn't unfamiliar. "I'm on my way to work," she said, her voice steady, but Jake barely acknowledged her words. Officer Jake Turner held Maya's license and registration in his hands, scrutinizing the details longer than necessary. He glanced at her through the open window, his gaze narrowing. "Where are you headed in such a hurry, ma'am?" Maya kept her composure, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. "I'm on my way to the hospital. I have a surgery scheduled." Jake raised an eyebrow, his skepticism apparent. "A surgery, huh? Are you visiting someone?" "No," Maya replied calmly. "I'm performing it." Jake's expression shifted slightly, but his tone remained condescending. "You're the surgeon?" he asked, disbelief lacing his words. He glanced at the modest sedan again, as though it confirmed his assumptions. "Yes," Maya said, meeting his gaze steadily. "Now, if there's no issue, I'd like to get going. I can't afford to be late." Jake leaned against the car, deliberately prolonging the interaction. "You didn't signal before turning onto this road. That's a traffic violation." Maya frowned but kept her voice even. "I don't believe that's accurate, officer. I signaled before making my turn." "Well, I didn't see it," Jake said flatly. He tilted his head, studying her as if looking for another reason to justify the stop. "Do you live around here?" Maya's fingers tightened slightly on the wheel, but her voice remained calm. "I don't see how that's relevant." "It's a simple question," Jake shot back. "This area doesn't get a lot of outsiders." Maya took a steadying breath. She recognized the thinly veiled insinuation, but chose not to react. "I'm traveling through on my way to the hospital. I'm sure you understand the urgency of my work." Jake smirked slightly as if dismissing her importance. "I'll need to run your plates. Sit tight." He walked back to his cruiser, taking his time. Maya watched him in the rearview mirror, her frustration mounting. Time was slipping away, and the surgery she was scheduled to perform was critical. Yet she knew from experience that challenging Jake's authority directly could escalate the situation further. When Jake returned, he handed her documents back but didn't step away. "What kind of surgery are you performing?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "A heart valve replacement," Maya replied curtly. "Now, if you'll excuse me," Jake interrupted, holding up a hand. "I'm not done yet. Your car registration's up to date, but I'll need to check the trunk. Standard procedure." "Is it?" Maya asked, her voice firm but calm. "Because I don't believe a traffic stop warrants a vehicle search." Jake bristled, his authority feeling challenged. "Are you refusing, ma'am?" "No," Maya said, her calm demeanor unwavering. "But I am questioning the necessity of this." Jake leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "Questioning my process isn't going to help you. Pop the trunk." Maya exhaled softly and pressed the release button. Jake walked to the back of the car, opening the trunk and finding nothing but a neatly organized set of medical tools and supplies. He stared at them for a moment before slamming the trunk shut. He returned to her window, his expression neutral, but his tone clipped. "You're free to go." Maya nodded, her face a mask of calm professionalism. "Thank you, officer. I trust this stop was enlightening." Her words hung in the air as she drove away, leaving Jake standing by his cruiser. He shrugged it off, chalking it up to another routine stop. For Maya, however, it was a frustrating reminder of the biases she faced, even on her way to save a life. Maya pulled into the hospital parking lot, the weight of her encounter with Officer Turner still pressing on her mind. She glanced at the dashboard clock. She was running dangerously close to being late for the surgery. As she grabbed her bag and hurried toward the building, she took a deep breath to center herself. The frustration and disappointment from the traffic stop couldn't bleed into her work. Her patient needed her full focus. Inside the hospital, the energy was brisk but controlled. Colleagues greeted her with quick nods as she walked toward the surgical wing. Dr. Patel, her attending colleague, met her near the scrub room. "Cutting it close today, doctor." "Brooks," he teased lightly. Maya gave him a tight smile. "Unavoidable delay. Let's get to it." Moments later, she was in the operating room, her hands steady as she guided the team through the intricate heart valve replacement. Hours passed as Maya poured her skill and focus into the procedure. By the time it was over, her patient was stable, and she allowed herself a brief moment of relief. Another life saved. As she stepped out of the OR, her mind wandered back to the traffic stop. The subtle disdain in Jake's tone, the dismissiveness of her profession. It wasn't new, but it still stung. She shook her head, forcing the thought aside. There was no room for such frustrations in her world of life and death. Jake Turner, meanwhile, cruised through the suburban streets, his earlier interaction with Maya already fading from memory. To him, it had been just another stop, another instance of maintaining order. He didn't dwell on it. His focus was already on the next potential infraction. The quiet hum of the day was interrupted when a dispatch call crackled over the radio. "Units in the area, be advised of a vehicle fleeing from a robbery. Suspect last seen heading east on Oak Ridge Drive." Jake's adrenaline surged. He activated his lights and sirens, merging onto the busy road. Spotting a car matching the description, he pursued, weaving through traffic at high speeds. The suspect's vehicle swerved dangerously, and Jake pushed his cruiser harder, determined to close the gap. Suddenly, the suspect made a sharp turn onto a narrow street. Jake followed, but as he rounded the corner, his tires screeched against the pavement, and he lost control. The cruiser skidded, crashing violently into a parked truck. The force of the impact crumpled the front of his vehicle, and everything went dark. The call came through to the hospital as Maya was reviewing notes for her next case. Incoming trauma, severe car accident, male, mid-30s, critical condition, ETA 5 minutes. Maya straightened, her focus shifting instantly. She quickly prepped for the emergency, putting on her scrubs and reviewing the initial details being relayed from the ambulance. Severe chest trauma, possible internal bleeding. She braced herself for the intensity of what was to come. When the gurney rolled into the trauma bay, Maya moved forward with her usual efficiency. But as she approached the patient, she froze briefly, her breath catching. Lying unconscious on the stretcher was Officer Jake Turner. His face was bruised, his uniform torn, and his breathing labored. Recognition dawned immediately. This was the same man who had stopped her on the way to the hospital. "Dr. Brooks?" one of the nurses prompted, noticing her hesitation. Maya blinked, snapping herself back into the moment. "Let's move him to the OR. Prepare for a thoracotomy," she instructed firmly. There was no room for personal feelings now. Whatever had happened between them hours ago was irrelevant. This man's life was in her hands. The operating room buzzed with controlled chaos as Maya led the team. The damage was extensive. Multiple rib fractures, a punctured lung, and internal bleeding that required immediate intervention. Maya worked methodically, her training and experience guiding her through the complex procedure. As she repaired the torn blood vessels and stabilized his breathing, a part of her couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. Hours ago, Jake had treated her as though she didn't belong. Now his life depended on her skills and professionalism. It wasn't anger or vindication she felt, but a deep sense of responsibility. She had taken an oath to save lives, regardless of who the person was. "Pressure's stabilizing," the anesthesiologist reported, breaking Maya's thoughts. "Good. Let's close," Maya replied, her voice steady. She completed the procedure with precision, ensuring every detail was accounted for. By the time Jake was wheeled into recovery, his condition had stabilized. For now, he was out of danger. After the surgery, Maya stepped out of the OR, exhaustion creeping in. She removed her gloves and scrubbed her hands thoroughly, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The weight of the day pressed heavily on her. She knew Jake would wake up and face the reality of his actions, how his biases had collided with the unexpected truth of who she was. But for now, she was content knowing she had done her part. She had saved his life, not out of obligation to prove anything, but because it was the right thing to do. Her duty as a doctor was to heal, and she had fulfilled that duty with integrity. As she walked toward the break room to catch her breath, her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Patel. "Another life saved, Brooks. You're a force of nature." Maya allowed herself a small smile. She didn't feel like a force of nature, just a person trying to do the best she could in an imperfect world. Jake Turner's eyes fluttered open, the harsh white of hospital light stinging his vision. His head felt heavy, his chest ached with every breath, and his surroundings were unfamiliar. He tried to move but winced as pain rippled through his body. A soft beeping noise drew his attention to the heart monitor beside him, and slowly his memories began to resurface. The chase, the crash, and then darkness. "Officer Turner, you're awake," a nurse said gently, stepping closer to his bed. "You're at Brookhaven General. You were brought in after the accident. The surgery was successful." "Surgery?" Jake croaked, his voice barely audible. The nurse nodded. "You were in critical condition, but Dr. Brooks performed the operation. She saved your life." The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. "Dr. Brooks?" Jake repeated, his throat dry. Images of the earlier traffic stop flooded his mind. The black woman he had dismissed and questioned, the one whose profession he had doubted. A sinking feeling gripped his chest, more oppressive than the pain of his injuries. "She'll be in to check on you shortly," the nurse continued, oblivious to the turmoil brewing inside him. "Just rest for now." As the nurse left, Jake lay back, his thoughts swirling. The irony of the situation was impossible to ignore. The woman he had treated with disdain, the woman whose credibility he had questioned, had held his life in her hands and chosen to save it. The realization was like a weight pressing down on him, heavier than anything he'd carried before. An hour later, the door to Jake's room opened quietly, and Dr. Maya Brooks stepped inside. Her expression was calm and professional, her demeanor unshaken by the irony of their reunion. She carried a clipboard, her steps purposeful as she approached his bedside. "Officer Turner," she began, her voice steady, "it's good to see you awake. How are you feeling?" Jake struggled to meet her gaze, his embarrassment palpable. I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice low. "You don't have to say anything," Maya replied, glancing at his chart. "Your surgery was successful. We repaired your injuries, and your vitals are stable. With time and rehabilitation, you should make a full recovery." Jake swallowed hard. "Dr. Brooks, I need to apologize." Maya set the clipboard down and folded her hands in front of her. "For what, Officer Turner?" Jake's face reddened. "For earlier, the traffic stop. I treated you unfairly. I made assumptions and I was wrong. I'm so sorry." Maya regarded him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke, her tone calm but firm. "Your apology is noted, Officer Turner. But let me ask you this. Would you be apologizing if I weren't the person who saved your life?" The question hung in the air, and Jake felt its weight settle over him. He didn't have an answer, and Maya didn't press him for one. Instead, she continued, "The issue isn't just about what happened between us. It's about the assumptions you make and the way you treat people based on those assumptions. I've encountered officers like you before, quick to judge, quick to assert authority without considering the humanity of the person in front of you." Jake felt his throat tighten. "I didn't mean intent doesn't erase impact," Maya interjected gently but firmly. "You may not have intended harm, but your actions had consequences. If I hadn't been calm or cooperative, How might that stop have ended? How many others have you treated the same way without considering what they were going through? Jake lowered his gaze, the reality of her words cutting deeper than he'd expected. You're right, he admitted quietly. I've never thought about it that way. Maya softened slightly, her tone losing its edge but not its conviction. It's not too late to change, Officer Turner. Every day you have a choice to approach people with dignity and respect, regardless of your assumptions. That choice can make all the difference. Jake nodded, his mind racing. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not just for saving my life, but for making me see things differently. Maya picked up her clipboard and checked his vitals one last time. You're welcome, she said simply. I hope you take this opportunity to reflect and grow. You've been given a second chance, and not everyone gets that. As she turned to leave, Jake called after her. Dr. Brooks. She paused, looking back at him. For what it's worth, he said. I'll do better. Maya gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. I hope so. When Maya stepped out of the room, she let out a small sigh. Encounters like these were emotionally draining, but they also reinforced why she did what she did. Her role as a doctor wasn't just about saving lives. It was about reminding people of the humanity that connected them all, even in the face of prejudice. Jake, meanwhile, lay in silence, replaying the conversation in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt the walls of his perspective begin to crack. Maya's words echoed in his ears. Every day you have a choice. He resolved to make better ones moving forward. The quiet of the hospital room gave Jake Turner ample time to think. Each moment stretched into hours as he replayed the events of the day over and over in his mind. The crash had shaken him physically, but it was Dr. Maya Brooks' calm, composed presence and her words that truly unsettled him. She had saved his life without hesitation or malice, despite the disdainful way he had treated her earlier. Jake felt a pang of guilt as he recalled his dismissal of her professionalism, the unnecessary questions, and his refusal to see her as anything other than an outsider. The realization that his actions had been rooted in biases he barely understood gnawed at him. This wasn't the first time he had made such assumptions, but it was the first time he'd had to confront them so directly. Meanwhile, in the hospital corridors, Maya's colleagues couldn't help but discuss the irony of the situation. Dr. Patel, her attending colleague, shook his head in admiration. It takes real grace to handle something like that the way you did, he said to her over coffee in the break room. Not everyone could put aside personal feelings like that. Maya shrugged, though a small smile played on her lips. It's not about personal feelings. It's about doing the right thing. That's what this job is about. The staff buzzed with similar sentiments, praising her professionalism and integrity. Maya, however, remained focused on her work. The situation was a reminder of the challenges she faced daily, but also of the responsibility she carried to lead by example. For Jake, the road to recovery was not just physical, but deeply personal. The conversations he had with Maya lingered, prompting him to confront questions he had long avoided. Why had he assumed the worst of her? How many others had he treated unfairly without realizing the impact of his actions? Determined to change, Jake decided to take the first step. He reached out to a counselor who specialized in addressing implicit biases and prejudice. Their sessions were difficult but eye-opening, peeling back layers of ingrained beliefs and challenging him to think critically about his role as an officer. In addition to counseling, Jake began attending community meetings, listening to the stories and experiences of the people he served. The meetings were humbling, offering him a new perspective on the struggles many faced and the ways his actions as a police officer could either exacerbate or alleviate those struggles. Each day, Jake worked to rebuild himself, not just as an officer, but as a person. He knew the process would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time, he felt a genuine commitment to change. It wasn't about redeeming himself in the eyes of others. It was about living up to the values he had once claimed to uphold. Maya Brooks sat at her desk, reviewing a patient file with her usual focus. Outside her office window, the city bustled with life, a contrast to the quiet contemplation within. The events of the past weeks lingered in her mind, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the work still to be done. Her encounter with Officer Jake Turner had been one of many instances where bias and misunderstanding clashed with the reality of her life and profession. Yet she chose to view it as an opportunity to reaffirm her belief in compassion and professionalism. Maya had long embraced the idea that her role extended beyond the operating room. As a black woman and a highly skilled surgeon, she was no stranger to assumptions and prejudices. But saving lives wasn't just about surgical precision. It was about demonstrating dignity, grace, and resilience in the face of ignorance. That, she believed, was the true power of her work. The situation with Jake had tested those principles, and while challenging, it also reinforced her commitment to lead by example. Meanwhile, Jake was undergoing his own transformation. The accident and the realization of Maya's role in saving his life had been a wake-up call. For years, he had navigated his work as an officer with little reflection, relying on authority and assumptions. But now those assumptions had been laid bare, forcing him to confront the biases he hadn't fully acknowledged. Jake sought help, attending counseling sessions to explore the roots of his prejudices. He also began participating in community meetings, listening to the stories of people whose lives were shaped by the very systemic issues he had often ignored. The process wasn't easy. It required vulnerability and a willingness to change. But Jake committed himself to it with sincerity. Each small act, from a respectful greeting to a conscious pause before making assumptions, became a step toward rebuilding trust with the community he served. Months later, their paths crossed again at a community event focused on bridging the gap between law enforcement and the public. Maya was one of the speakers, sharing her insights on accountability and empathy in public service. Her words carried weight, resonating deeply with the audience, including Jake, who sat in the crowd, listening intently. As the event concluded, Maya stepped off the stage, engaging with attendees. Jake approached hesitantly, his movements uncertain, but his resolve clear. When their eyes met, Maya offered a small, knowing smile. Jake returned the gesture with a respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of growth and understanding. In that brief exchange, there was no need for words. Both had come full circle, their journeys reflective of change, growth, in the possibility of a better future. Maya returned to her work, inspired to continue her efforts for equality and justice. Jake, too, walked away with renewed determination to be the kind of officer his badge was meant to represent, one who served with integrity and respect.